Thank you all for being here tonight. I know that there are a lot of competing demands. The weather doesn't really help so much either, but we're grateful to have you here with us this evening. I also want to thank Maya Bill for doing an amazing job in helping to organize tonight's event. So another round of applause for Maya. It's been an amazing year at the ACLU of Pennsylvania, so that's something that we're very proud of. We defeated an amazingly onerous and hideous voter ID law that threatened to disenfranchise hundreds of thousands of Pennsylvanians, so we're proud of that. We brought marriage equality to Pennsylvania as well. It's been a great year, so there's no doubt about that. But just as we've been celebrating these victories, and particularly when you think about marriage equality, where it was even a year ago, let alone 2 or 3 years ago, the progress is almost unfathomable. But it's almost as if, in the context of reproductive rights, it's been the exact reverse, right? So even as we're celebrating all these victories, we know that our approach to preserving a woman's rights to choose has to change. And so that's what tonight's conversation really is about, sort of starting that conversation about what we need to do, right, to have a different conversation, to destigmatize abortion. Now, we don't expect that tonight will solve it all, but we do think that we'll be starting a conversation that's not really been had elsewhere in the country. We're thrilled that Louise Melling chose Pennsylvania to sort of kick off this dialogue. And so we'll look forward to hearing from Louise in a minute. I want to say a little bit about her before we get started. And to be clear, when I say that we're going in the opposite, indeed the wrong direction when it comes to reproductive rights, I want to just say a couple of things. I want to paint a very brief national picture for you as well as talk very briefly about some of the things that have happened in Pennsylvania. So over the past year alone, there have been over 300 anti-choice bills introduced around the country designed, again, to reduce a woman's right to choose. The ACLU around the country has been involved in defeating 70 of those, so we know that we still have a long way to go. The situation is no better here in Pennsylvania at all. Just for example, there are 2 laws that really threaten to do a major disservice to a woman's rights to choose. And one of them is a TRAP law. TRAP means targeted regulation of abortion providers. And really what that is designed to do is put clinics out of business, frankly. There's really no secret about that. The second really offensive, in my opinion, law is one that bans insurance coverage of abortion care and policies sold on the health insurance exchange. This is new and unprecedented. This has not happened before, that the state government has prohibited or sought to prohibit, or prohibited in this case, a private insurer from providing abortion coverage to a private paying customer. So they've gone beyond sort of the public domain and have gotten their tentacles into the private sector. That's really, really scary. The good news, to the extent that there is good news, is that the ACLU has been around fighting these battles for decades. And we're committed to continuing to do so, again, as I said, recognizing that the conversation has to change, the tactics need to be tweaked, we need to do things a little differently. So we're going to talk about the Scarlet Letter A and what we need to do to destigmatize abortion. I'm going to have Louise Melling join us in a minute. Now, she whispered to me just before I got up here that she wanted to keep her introduction short. I'm exposing her that it's going to be short-ish. You heard that show Blackish? This is short-ish. Louise Melling is a deputy legal director of the ACLU and the director of its Center for Liberty, as well as a longtime reproductive rights advocate. The Center for Liberty that Louise directs encompasses the ACLU's work on reproductive freedom, women's rights, LGBT rights, and freedom of religion and belief. Before assuming this role, Louise was director of the ACLU Reproductive Freedom Project, in which capacity she oversaw nationwide litigation, communications research, public education campaigns, and advocacy efforts in the state legislatures. Louise has appeared in federal and state courts around the country to challenge laws that restrict reproductive rights. She's appeared in many media outlets, including CNN, MSNBC, PBS NewsHour, Frontline, The New York Times, Washington Post, and USA Today. And on a personal level, I've known Louise for almost 20 years. We started when we were 5-year-old child prodigies at the ACLU 20 years ago. But from day one, Louise was unfailingly warm, humble, affirming, humorous, supportive, upbeat, thoughtful, passionate, brilliant, full of heart and vision for a fair and just society. She was really one of the first of my colleagues to break down silos and to see the interconnectedness of racial justice, gender equality, LGBT equality, and other areas of reform. And she usually could be counted on to wear really bright colors. Today she's wearing the New York black. But it's my sincere honor, notwithstanding the black attire, to introduce my dear friend, Louise Melling.
My face might be red, but my clothes aren't. But first of all, thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much to the co-sponsors. Thank you to my dear colleagues in the ACLU Pennsylvania, and thank you again, Maya. As you all know, what I want to talk about today is the big A word in America, which is abortion, and talk about reasons why we should be talking about it out loud. I want to organize this around 4 basic points. So first is the challenges of the time. Second is what scares me most. Third is reason for passion. And fourth is reason for hope. And I come to you as a lawyer, and I really like being a lawyer, but I'm not going to talk to you about the law. Today's talk really is an appeal to your heart and why you should care, because I think that's the most important thing. If that changes, we can actually lift the Scarlet ladder. So the challenges, I'm going to try to do this briefly because I think you probably know a fair amount just from the news. Reggie's already highlighted, but I will say this. I've been at the ACLU for more than 20 years. This recent spate really leaves me pretty speechless in terms of what's happening. My polite way of talking about it is to say that it's a big, hot, fiery mess in terms of what's happening in the states. So here's just a little taste of what's happened in the last, let's just say, we'll pick like 2 years or so. So one, okay, you can guess the state, Texas. It's not all about Texas, but Texas is pretty illustrative of what's going on. So Texas, for example, passed a law that said that all physicians who provide abortions have to have admitting privileges at a nearby hospital. You might nod and think, sounds good, right? My doctor could take me to a hospital. It's a provision opposed by the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and the American Medical Association as not necessary. Patient will be admitted to a hospital anyway. Many times the requirements about what you have to do in order to get those privileges include you have to be able to admit a certain number of patients, which doesn't happen with the provider. You have to live in town, which you may know is often not true of abortion providers, particularly in the South. That provision threatened to and did in fact close many clinics in Texas when it went into effect. So the number goes from something around 36 to 21 once that law takes effect, leaving entire swaths of the southern parts of Texas pretty much without any service provider. Texas, we all read about it. Meanwhile, Alabama, Wisconsin, North Dakota, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Louisiana, did I say those already? All passed similar restrictions. Wisconsin and Alabama, the provisions threatened to close half the clinics in the state. North Dakota, Mississippi threatened to close the only clinics in the state. So Texas is not unique in any way in that sense. But, you know, Texas, hell, that's not enough, right? So layer it on Texas also passes a law that says every single provider of abortions has to have a facility, as Reggie was referring to, that's targeted regulation of abortion facilities that looks like a mini hospital. That's true for every provider, first trimester, any stage, threatened to take the number of clinics down from 21 or so to 7. Courts let that one go into effect. Many clinics closed. We just recently got relief from the state. But it's just evidence of what's happening. When Reggie said what's happening in the states is closing clinics, there's nothing, that's an exaggeration in that statement. Meanwhile, Arkansas passes a ban on abortions after 12 weeks. North Dakota bans abortions after 6 weeks. Ohio passes a law saying that public hospitals can't provide admitting privileges to their doctors, but doctors have to have admitting privileges in order to provide abortions. Indiana passes a law that imposes all sorts of requirements for surgical abortions on doctors who only do medical abortions. Those are abortions by pills. More states restrict abortion in their insurance coverage, right? Let's just ban abortion in insurance coverage. Other facilities, Missouri adopted a 72-hour waiting period. That's a 72-hour waiting period from the time you get counseling about abortion until you're allowed to get an abortion. South Dakota, I don't know why this law really bugs me more than any, it's very disproportionate. South Dakota passes a law that says the 72-hour waiting period doesn't include weekends and holidays. That's on top of everything else. That's just what happened in the last 2 years. Meanwhile, you have more than half the states in the country requiring women to have these waiting periods after they receive counseling. Meanwhile, you have an increasing number of states passing laws requiring women to have ultrasounds and for doctors either to describe the ultrasound or even to show the ultrasound to the woman seeking abortion. You have restrictions on how the procedures are done that are contrary to medical standards. You have bans on insurance in the exchanges and in the private industry. As I say, I thought it was a constitutional right that was at issue. Yet that's what's happening in the states around the country. As I often say, I'm glad my 40th birthday looked a lot better than Rose's 40th birthday in the sense of what's been happening. And you may say, okay, so you're the ACLU, there are the courts, you can go to courts. And for a long time, that was people's real reaction, was to think, okay, so the state legislatures, they do all these horrible things, but you can go to court and you can fix it, so why are you getting so worked up? Even if that were true once upon a time, that so is not the story today. It is true, Alabama and Wisconsin, those provisions aren't in effect because of litigation. The provision that shut the clinics down to 7 has now been lifted because of litigation. But there are other measures, like the insurance measures, that are harder to challenge. The list is long of what's passing. The list of what we think we can challenge is smaller. The list of what we will win is smaller still. And all you have to do is just pause and think about the dynamics at the federal court to see why that's true. So the highest authority, the John Roberts Court, the deciding feature in terms of whether we win or not, Justice Kennedy, the standard by which the courts evaluate whether or not a provision is unconstitutional, this is the test they apply, it's called the undue burden test. It has no real contours. The judges can sort of see it or not see it, and very often until recently, they were almost never seeing it. They were almost never saying something was an undue burden. And you now have arguments with the state of Texas going so far as to say, if the law doesn't bar more than 50% of women from getting abortion, then it's not an undue burden under the standard. Now, the court didn't accept that, but this is now the kind of world in which we live. You sort of up the ante in rhetoric, and this is the kind of position that's being taken in the United States Supreme Court by the state of Texas. I'll just note, because I'm bitter, that the court in that case didn't grant us relief. So that is the state of affairs. That's the challenge. That's not what worries me most. I'm not feeling good about that, but that's not what worries me most. What worries me most really is the stigma surrounding abortion and how the very word in many respects has become unspeakable. So here's just a few examples that sort of highlight that for me. President Obama, on the anniversary of Roe versus Wade, if you look at his statements, most of them are omitting one key word: abortion. It's the anniversary of Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade is nothing but about our right to abortion. It's not that Obama's anti-choice. It's just that there's nothing to be gained. There are political disincentives from mentioning it as opposed to any kind of incentives. One of my former assistants, when she was working for us, sort of learned the statistic that nearly 1 in 3 women will have an abortion during her lifetime. So she worked at the ACLU, she worked in the Reproductive Freedom Project, she went to a seven-sister college. And she said, "That is so curious. I've never met a woman who had an abortion." Oh, no. And I was like, yeah, you have. But it just speaks to how much silence there was there. Doctors and I regularly go to conferences of the doctors and staff who provide abortions, and they talk about the women who come in to have abortions and will say, "I'm not like those other women, this happened to me." And they themselves are distancing themselves, and somehow, as the doctor said, it's almost as if they think they're not getting an abortion, that they are in such a denial in many respects. And I was at a meeting that had other, people who work on these issues all the time, and we were talking about what you say when people ask you what you do. And many of the answers were women's health, reproductive rights, women's rights, but almost nobody said what was true, which is, given the political climate, most of us now dedicate almost all of our time to defending the right to abortion. Now, you may say it's because you don't want to be trapped in that uncomfortable conversation on the Amtrak train or the planes, for anybody who does talk on those vehicles. But I think it's deeper than that. I think it is also because even in our own communities that the word isn't really spoken enough or spoken. And last, this is now getting to be a sort of older example, but knocked up, schmortion. It says it all. It's the president, it's the women who seek abortions, it's popular culture. The word is unspeakable in many respects in the country. It's not a total surprise in some sense that that's true when you really think about the political dynamic in the country. So many hospitals will not let doctors provide abortions. Under the United States Supreme Court law, states can ban abortions in public hospitals. Many medical schools don't teach abortion. The standard, the United States Supreme Court standard as of 1992, says that the government can use its power to discourage a woman from having an abortion. The government can use its power to try to encourage women to have children. What other constitutional right can you name where we have a standard articulated by the United States Supreme Court that says the government can use all of its powers to discourage you from exercising your constitutional right? It's not a surprise in the face of that state legislatures then go around passing laws, not just to refuse to fund abortions. In America, of course they don't do that. But to refuse to provide fundings to groups that even provide referrals for abortions with their own dollars, or that provide abortions with their own dollars as a way of isolating themselves. It's not a total surprise that we saw a case that was the case that I think has sort of unnerved me most, and well, it's always one of the most unnerving cases, I can't pick what's most, of nurses at a public hospital in New Jersey who filed a case arguing that they should not be in any way required to participate in pre- and post-operative abortion activities. What that meant, it was not that they were in the OR. What that meant was they were objecting to providing services that included making sure a woman had a ride home, taking her temperature, other services pre and post, and they said, we can't be required to do those services. It's a state of affairs that literally says that the people who provide abortions are increasingly pariahs, and the people who seek abortions are increasingly untouchable. Why else could you not touch the woman to take her temperature after she's had an abortion? In some sense, I said I wouldn't talk about the law, but I just have to say it. I really do blame the court for this, in some sense. I really do think that the United States Supreme Court is, in some sense, our modern day Puritans. They have sent out the letter by saying that the government can use its powers in these ways. So that's what troubles me most, because at the end of the day, no movement will survive and no movement will succeed if it's shrouded in total silence. So, passion. I spend a lot of time, I look, I see this, I stew, I fret, and I think, it's only going to change if people talk, it's only going to change if people act. Why would people act? And in particular, when I come to a college campus, I think, if I were 20, would I pick this issue? Would I make this my issue? So I have reasons why I do this. I'm in my early 50s. When I was young, it was an entirely different world. It was an entirely different world for women. When I was young, Ella Grasso she became the first woman governor who was elected in her own right. When I was young, Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs were having the famous tennis match, the Battle of the Sexes. When I was young, married women couldn't always get a credit card in their own names. When I was young, my mother and other people would talk about unintended pregnancies and how this affected them. When I was young, I knew that being a woman was not a good story. And I knew that not being able to control reproduction had something to do with it. And I didn't really like it one whit, and here I am. But that's my story. And my story, thank goodness, can't be your story, in the sense that the world's really still, ferociously imperfect, but it's radically, radically different for women these days in terms of education, in terms of economics, in terms of independence, in terms of our place in politics or business. Again, imperfect, but radically different. The world is very different in terms of contraception options and availability. The world is different in terms of, despite what's happening in the states, of abortion being legal and available to many women. So why should you care? Why would you make this your issue? Why would you want to step up to that challenge that I talked about before? So I'm going to offer some reasons, and I hope you find them persuasive. So, there's a couple that are really pretty obvious and basic. So one is, step on up if you have plans for your future, if you have dreams for your life, you have dreams for your families, you want to pay your rent. As the majority or most of the justices in the 1992 big Supreme Court decision, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, said, the ability of women to participate equally in the economic and social life of the nation has been facilitated by our ability to control our reproductive lives. It's true. Whether you can control affects whether you feed your children, whether you pay your rent, whether you continue school, what happens with your relationship, whether you can care for your parents. Second, I dare say, and this goes back to Kay's point, which is, if you've ever had sex, or at least heterosexual sex, you might want to step up. I think in many ways, and the court recognizes this as well, that we are in large part living our relationships with abortion and this right in the backdrop. We're counting on it in many respects, even if we're not actively taking our own actions to protect it. But those aren't enough. I don't think those work. I don't think those work to motivate you in the sense I think those work if there were a ban. We can't be trusted to think, we can't be trusted to be sure, we can't be trusted to know what's happening. And many of these laws are justified, they're defended as trying to protect women from regret. We don't want her to do something hasty, live her life with regret. Who else do we protect from regret? I think it might be children that we try to protect from regret. We don't ban marriage because somebody might regret marriage or take actions like this. So, if you think women can think, my team. Make this your issue if you think you shouldn't feel guilty because you pursue an education. because you want to control the size of your family, or because you're dealing with a mistake. So when I think about this issue, I think about the conversation that all too often happens around abortion. It's starting to tip a little bit right now. But that conversation, I'll say I participate in it, is a conversation that's often about women who are having abortions because they have a pregnancy that went awry for the woman's health or went awry for the health of the baby she wanted to have, or because she's pregnant as a result of rape or incest. Those are what, in my office, I call the good girls. Those are the good girls because they either wanted the pregnancy or they didn't want the sex. That's who we talk about. We don't talk about the majority of women. We don't talk about the extraordinary percentage of women who are really getting abortions, who are getting abortions to finish school, who are getting abortions because you already have children, who are getting abortions because you can't manage it, you just can't do it. Those are the women who I'll just refer to as the real women, the women who live in the real world, which I call messy. Life is messy, things happen, and then we make decisions. When I think about those stories, they really are about saying that you're selfish, in some sense. We wouldn't be afraid of speaking those things if it weren't that we weren't judging. And I often think, so I'm one of 4 children. There's a 15-year age gap between my oldest sibling and me. It wasn't exactly how my mother would have planned it, but I think about my mother's life, and if the world had been different, would my mother have been able to go to art school? My mother was admitted to art school and couldn't go. Would my mother have pursued a job she'd been offered doing paint restoration? Would my mother have become a substitute teacher the way she wanted to? I have no idea what my mother would have done. I think she probably would have had all of us. But I look at those choices, and I think if my mother had pursued those things, would I think my mother should be judged? Would I think my mother would have been selfish for having those dreams? Would my father ever have been judged selfish for having any dreams like that? I don't think so. So if you think that it's not selfish to have dreams if you're a woman, if you think it's not selfish to make a decision at a moment in your life not to become a mother, then you're on my team. Very much related is, make this your issue if you think that motherhood isn't the only proper role for women. As I've said, and I'll say it a lot, the court says you can use all your power to try to discourage women from having abortions and to encourage childbirth. And in one of the cases, Justice Kennedy wrote, this is an abortion case, respect for human life finds an ultimate expression in the bond of love the mother has for a child. I value parenthood. I value children. I value life. But I also agree with Justice Ginsburg, who said that this way of thinking, that we prefer childbirth, and in that context could ban abortions in the name of that, reflects very ancient notions about women and families. Ideas that we've long since discredited. So we have and I'm just going to make one other point, we have at the same time, we have Justice Kennedy saying this about the ultimate bond, and then we have South Dakota saying, requiring doctors to tell women that abortion kills a living human being. So that law was upheld, by the way, in court challenges. So at some level, we have a woman who faces a pregnancy who could pursue the ultimate love, or she could kill. That's sort of, no, but I mean, seriously, that's the construct we're setting. That's the message we're sending. It is no surprise in the face of that kind of messaging through our laws that women aren't speaking up. So if you're not down with that, if you don't think that's the 21st century of how we should be thinking about women and our roles, then my team. Make this your issue if you think women could be sexual beings, right? At the end of the day, I dare say this has something to do with sex. This has something to do with judging women for engaging in sex. And women are the ones in this sense who are bearing the cost. So you think that puritanical view isn't your view, you're with us. You're on our team. And the last, I think, make this your decision or join this if you want to make decisions about relationships and who you love. So Anthony Romero, the head of the ACLU, was speaking at a rally a few years ago in support of Planned Parenthood, and he stood up and he said, so you're probably wondering, what's the gay Latina guy doing here at the Repro rally? And he said, it's because at the end of the day, this is about our relationships, and this is about our families, and this is about our ability to make decisions about who we love. So if you want that power, it's my team. I want to say one other thing about this team. I say this as a person who, in my early years, debated whether men could participate in the Take Back the Night March we organized in the 80s. Take Back the Night March was the march to sort of challenge and contest the fact that it's so hard sometimes for women to be able to enjoy the night and walk, to be on the streets and be safe. This team is women and men. Women may first feel, I may feel most indignant, more indignant perhaps than Reggie, that women are being told that we can't think. But the ire shouldn't be only for women. Women may feel most indignant about being told that our proper role is women, but it shouldn't be only women who have the ire there. We may feel most upset about being told that we shouldn't be sexual, but again, that ire should not be limited to women. So, this team, it's open. At the end of the day, all those reasons just come down to some really basic principles. Make this your issue. Care about these chips if you care about, it's about like respect, right? It's about fairness. It's about survival, or it's about dreams. Which all brings me to my last thing, which is the reason for hope. Reggie didn't say it in the intro, but some people think I'm corny. And that brings me, like, the reason for hope is really the people in the room, all of you. It's you. Because at the end of the day, today, as going back to Kay's story, abortion is it's increasingly, people are starting to talk, but has become unspeakable. And the way that changes is with you and everybody else who's willing to start having conversations about this. It matters, right? So when it matters for purposes of the state legislatures, it matters for the courts even. The courts are willing to be, I'll say, like 2 steps ahead of the public, 2 steps ahead of the public discourse. I mean, this is a good court. That would be 2 steps ahead, right? But the courts will never be 20 steps ahead of what they think the public thinks. And the courts will certainly retreat if they think the climate isn't right and that there may be a backlash. And at the end of the day, our adversaries, they speak, they vote, they give money, they contact their legislators. So if you are a person in power and you're hearing only from that side, why would you stick your neck out? Why would you be the person who goes out on the limb about abortion? But most important, I just want to go back to that core point, which is, if we're silent, there's no movement that can win with that climate. There's no movement that can win by being silent. There's no movement that wins by being ashamed. And if we're silent, as I say, I think it gets easier to tell stories about us, to tell stories about who we are, because there's nothing to dislodge it. And it's easier for those stories then to become truth in some sense, truth at least in people's minds, because they get told over and over and there's nothing to dislodge it. So at the end of the day, I am asking you in some sense to step up and sort of help to put the sandbag in the dike. And when I say that, I think it's true. It's not as much fun as joining the LGBT team. I like a good party. I like a celebration, and I really love winning. It's really fun. And right now, this doesn't feel like the fun winning team. That doesn't mean that it's not essential. That doesn't mean it's not important, because losing looks really, really bad. So I'm asking you to step up, and I'm asking you to step up to do things that aren't extraordinary. Be active. Be active in politics. Speak up. Do something as essential as starting conversations. Starting conversations about why you care. Starting conversations with people you might not have. Personal conversations, not rhetorical conversations. That helps to dislodge the stereotypes. I'm just going to tell one quick story, which I went to this lobby day when Anthony was speaking, and I got sent to the office of a congressional member who is anti-choice. And the constituents, all I was doing was chaperoning constituents, and they got lost. I got there. And the staffer said, well, why don't we talk? And I said, because I don't have the constituents. And he said, oh, let's just talk anyway. And so we got talking, and I said something like, well, of course you would support Planned Parenthood, Dumbo here. And he said, no, did you just see that video? Why in New York they don't even require parental consent for teens? I said, well, they're not required to require parental consent. There's no law that says they have to do that. And he said, but it's just wrong. And so there I was, nice middle-class lady in a suit, and I say, I never would have told my parents. I would have lied. I would have left the state. My brother would have taken me. I come from a fabulous family, super supportive, but I was told if I ever had sex, I would be kicked out of the house. And I believed it. Never would have told. And you watch the guy sort of twitch a little because I didn't fit his stereotype. I don't know what his stereotype was, but I had just busted something for him. And at the end of the day, when I left, he said, this was so interesting. But I say that because you have no idea almost how little it takes to transform and change the stereotypes people have. And unless we have those conversations, unless we force people to start to think differently, unless we force people to recognize that this is sort of an ad from the National Abortion Federation, names you call a woman who has an abortion: mother, daughter, sister. We know how important that kind of motif has been in the LGBT community, and I think it's critical here. I'm going to end by telling a story, and I'm going to tell the story as a way of just thinking about, I'm asking you to do something that's not, look, if we start winning, it's going to be really rewarding, but it's going to be tough going for a while. And so what will make you step up to this? What will make you keep on in this? I keep a picture up in my office of one of the very first clients I had. I sued the state of Idaho, arguing that the Medicaid program in the state had to pay for abortions. And I got a call from the high-risk OBGYN telling me that she had just seen a patient who had just gotten very bad news about her pregnancy. And the woman was on Medicaid, and the nurse didn't know what the woman would do, but she gave the woman my number in case she needed help. So the woman called me, and she said, I don't know what I want to do. I want to talk to some other people. And I said, fine, but if this is what you choose and you need help, then here's my number. You have my number. So ultimately, the woman called me back, and she said, I've decided to have an abortion. I'm 18. My husband and I have decided we're just too young, and our marriage is too young to face this challenge. So we went to court, and we saw an emergency order. We saw an emergency order directing the state to pay for the care she sought, just as it would pay on the same terms as it would pay for her if she continued the pregnancy to term. And the judge had granted me relief for a different woman on this, and the judge denied the relief. The woman in this case was known as Linda Coe. I just want to note, it's extraordinary. We had women in our cases in the 90s. No woman would step up in the 21st century now into these cases. Just the climate is just so different. So there was a hospital that would provide the abortion, but the hospital said she had to have, and I truly don't remember whether it was $2,500 or $5,000 to walk in the door. Linda Coe was 18. She was on Medicaid. She didn't have $2,500. So we raised the money that night. I would beg from any one of you in a heartbeat on those occasions. We raised the money, we paid for the abortion, and we paid for the funeral she wanted to have for the child she very much wanted. That was 1994. Linda has gone on to send me regularly pictures of the children she went on to have. There's never been 6 months where we haven't spoken since. She talks to me about the star she puts on the tree for the son she wanted to have. She talks to me about her children. When we had a blackout in New York, she was the first person who called me to say, "Hi, Louise, it's Linda. I hope you're okay." We have that connection because abortion matters. It's about dreams, it's about hopes, it's about families, it's about how you live your life. So it should be speakable. Say it out loud. Thank you.